Graveyard effects are some of the best effects in the game, as usually it's like gaining extra advantage from a card you've already used. But in this list, we'll go over some of the worst graveyard effects in the game, which there are not a lot of. Most graveyard effects are pretty decent. And at number 10, we have Induced Explosion. This card's graveyard effect is that when cards you control are destroyed by your opponent's spell card effects, you can banish this card from your graveyard to destroy one card your opponent controls. And its on-field effect is pretty much the same. If cards you control are destroyed by your opponent's spell card effects, you can then activate this card to destroy one card your opponent controls. So it seems like the ultimate spell card counter card. And before Lightning Storm came out, this wasn't really a huge concern for most decks. You can count on cards occasionally being destroyed by spell cards, but unless your opponent's deck was built around that, like Sky Strikers, it didn't happen very often. And even then, you probably want to prevent your cards from being destroyed, not use this card which just destroys one of your opponent's cards in retaliation, and only if your cards are destroyed specifically by spells. It's just a little bit too niche of a counter card, which probably isn't worth its counter card effect, as only being able to pop one card for having your cards destroyed by spells isn't super good. But still one of the most useful effects on this list, since it can at least destroy cards and impact the field. And at number 9, we have Barrage Blast. This is a continuous trap card which allows you to once per turn detach as many Xyz materials from machine type monsters you control to destroy cards on your opponent's side of the field equal to the amount of materials you detached. So, if you have a whole bunch of machine Xyz monsters in the field, you can convert their materials into targeted destruction. Which, hey, isn't half bad, especially since you can use this effect during either player's turn. So it allows you to convert materials into quick effect disruption. Its graveyard effect is that if this card is in your graveyard and a machine Xyz monster you control is destroyed, you can banish this card in addition to one machine Xyz monster from your graveyard to then inflict effect damage to your opponent equal to the rank of that Xyz monster times 200. So if you use this on a rank 4 monster, you get to inflict 800 points of damage, which isn't a really super good effect on a graveyard effect. But assuming you use this card with the archetype it was intended for, rank 10 trains, this card has the potential to inflict 2,000 points of damage, which is pretty good, in an archetype that's already able to inflict hefty chunks of damage thanks to cards like Gustav Max. Although this is just kind of a minor extra effect to a card that's not really used, for an effect that the archetype doesn't really care about, on a condition that you can't really proc yourself very easily. So while it's not terrible if used in the archetype it was intended for, it's not really something they go out of the way to use anyway, which is why it makes this list, because honestly, there's not a lot of bad graveyard effects in the game. Most of them are pretty good. Half this list will just be mediocre graveyard effects, and we won't get to the truly less than mediocre effects until we get to the higher spots. And at number 8, we have Malefic Truth Dragon. This is one of the highest attacks on a main deck monster, and it technically has a graveyard effect, where if a Malefic monster you control is destroyed while this card is in your hand or graveyard, you can pay half your life points to special summon this card, as long as there's a field spell card out. Otherwise, this card will destroy itself right away. And this card has a pretty decent effect on the field. Kind of, where if it destroys a monster by battle, you can then destroy all of your opponent's other phase-up monsters. And with a base attack of 5,000, this card can beat over pretty much anything in order to proc its effect. Now, the problem with this card lies in the fact that it requires you to pay half your life points to special summon it, and the archetype it's part of, the Malefics. You'd have to play a pretty pure Malefic deck in order to bring this card out, and Malefics do not allow other cards to attack while they're on the field, nor do they allow other Malefic monsters onto the field. So if you bring out Malefic Truth Dragon, that's it for your Malefic monsters. And these restrictions to the Malefic archetype were so bad that they actually released new support for them, which just straight up changes their effects to allow other Malefic monsters on the field, with the continuous spell card Malefic Territory. Although it requires you to play their field spell card, which isn't super good either. Plus, the Malefic monsters that do see play are generally used in decks as combo extenders and one-offs, and not played in any quantity big enough where you could realistically also play Malefic Truth Dragon. So in the future, if they release better support cards with the effect of Malefic Territory, Malefic Truth Dragon might finally be able to see some play. Maybe. And at number 7, we have Dice Roll Battle. This is a trap card which has an effect that can only be activated when an opponent's monster declares an attack, which allows you to use a Speedroid monster from your graveyard and a Speedroid Tuner monster from your hand in order to special summon a Synchro monster from your extra deck using those 2 cards. Which isn't the best effect in the world. Generally, battle traps aren't super good, since they're sitting decks for spell or trap card removal, and usually get destroyed before they get a chance to ever activate. And this card basically just allows you to synchro summon during your opponent's turn anyway, although it does allow you to use one of the materials from your graveyard. And then its graveyard effect can only be activated during your opponent's battle step, where you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to target a face-up attack position synchro monster on both sides of the field, in which case you get to force those 2 cards to battle each other. This card basically requires your opponent to also have a synchro monster out, so it's already pretty limited in when you can actually use it, but it does have the potential to give you 1 extra free attack, which would be a lot more useful if it wasn't during your opponent's battle phase only. And at number 6, we have Sabatiel, the Philosopher Stone. This card has a graveyard effect that can only be activated if you have 3 copies of this card in the graveyard, in which case you get to banish all 3 copies in order to target 1 monster on the field, who will then gain attack equal to the highest attack monster on the field until the end of the turn. So if you control a monster at 2,000 attack, and your opponent controls one with 3,000, you can have your monster gain 3,000 in order to go up to 5,000 for a turn, which is a pretty hefty attack boost from a graveyard effect, with the only downside to it is the whole requiring 3 copies of the card in order to do this. Getting 3 copies of any one card into the graveyard in order for an attack boost is not really worth it, especially since its normal effect, while, used from your hand, isn't super good either, where you can pay half your life points to search out a fusion spell card from your deck, which is good, but you can only do this if you specifically control a winged Karibo in your graveyard, which means it's not super useful, as that's just a little bit too much of a setup for an effect that requires you to pay half your life points. This card was, however, an anime card that was incredibly overpowered, so they did what they usually do with these kinds of situations, and just gave it an incredibly nerfed effect in the actual TCG, that kind of vaguely resembles what it used to do, which was to give it a bad activatable effect, and then a bad graveyard effect. And at number 5, we have Koz Morning. This is a continuous trap card for the Cosmo archetype, where monsters who are destroyed in battle with Cosmo monsters are shuffled into the deck instead of going to the graveyard, which is not half bad. This essentially allows your attacking Cosmo monsters to bypass a lot of floating effects when they destroy monsters by battle. It also has a graveyard effect, where you can banish this card so the first time you would take battle damage involving a Cosmo monster you control, you instead gain that amount of life points. So it basically stops you from taking battle damage, and then will give you a small life point boost. Kind of like the effect of Rainbow Life, but for 1 battle. It's not the best effect in the world, but it's not a negative effect either. You won't be playing this card in your deck in order to prevent a little bit of battle damage, and you probably wouldn't be playing it for its on-field effect either, as this is not a super heavily played Cosmo card, despite the fact that the deck did see a lot of competitive success in the past. This is just a case of an incredibly minor positive effect, which when compared to all the other graveyard effects in the game, definitely puts it on a lower end of the spectrum in terms of usefulness. And at number 4, we have DD Reroll. While this card is on your side of the field, your Dark Contract cards cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. And since DD decks do play a lot of face-up, spell or trap card, Dark Contract cards, this is a technically positive effect for them, though they don't care that much about losing card advantage in order to protect their face-up Dark Contract cards. And this card also has a graveyard effect, where you can banish this card from your graveyard in order to target up to 3 of your banished DD cards, in order to shuffle them back into your deck. If this card shuffled them back into the graveyard, it wouldn't be half bad. Returning them to the deck, however, that's not really worth playing this card at all. If you could gain advantage while shuffling them back, like how the Orcus Link monsters use their effects, then maybe DD decks would actually use this card. But since it has a mediocre on-field effect, and then an almost useless graveyard effect, it surprisingly doesn't really see competitive play. And at number 3, we have Iron Core of Koa'ki Meiru. This card's only effect is a graveyard effect, which can only be activated during your draw phase, where, if this card is in your graveyard, you can add it to your hand instead of drawing, or you can send a Koa'ki Meiru monster from your hand to the graveyard in order to add this card to your hand. Now, this card is required for some Koa'ki Meiru monsters to use their effects, so it did occasionally see competitive play, because Koa'ki decks had no choice but to play this card, even though they didn't really want to. It was kind of a weird mechanic. Koa'ki Meiru monsters had a lot of effects that required them to either send an iron core of Koa'ki Meiru from their hand to the graveyard during the end phase, or reveal a different card from their hand in order to stay on the field. And some of them required interactions with the iron core of Koa'ki Meiru in order to hit the field at all, like in the case of Koa'ki Meiru Maximus, where you had to banish an iron core from your hand in order to special summon it. And Koa'ki Meiru Maximus decks were even a top meta deck in Duel Links when they came out, to the point where Koa'ki Meiru Maximus had to be restricted on their ban list. So it's not like the card didn't see play. It even saw play in normal Yu-Gi-Oh as well. But I guarantee you, the people who played Koa'ki Meiru decks probably wish that iron core of Koa'ki Meiru wasn't so useless, but technically, since it does have an alternative graveyard effect to return to your hand by replacing itself with a monster, it's just a tiny bit more useful than the top 2 spots on this list, especially since it's so required for a lot of the archetype to work. And at number 2, we have the Phantom Knights of Tomb Shield. Now, the Phantom Knight archetype is known for having a lot of wonderful graveyard effects. So many good graveyard effects that their Link monster, Phantom Knights of the Rusty Bardiche, got banned, partly because it could send Phantom Knight monsters to the graveyard in order to also search out cards. So, it's almost a wonder why this card got the short end of the stick, as its graveyard effect, which can be only activated during your turn, except the turn this card was sent to the graveyard of course, allows you to banish this card in order to negate the effects of one face-up trap card your opponent controls until the end of the turn. Now, this is incredibly restrictive in what it can even target, and a lot of decks don't play face-up trap cards, so it's useless against a majority of decks, and it doesn't really solve the problem as it only negates the effect for one turn. So in best case scenario, your opponent has an oppressive floodgate out, like Imperial Order, and you want to use spell cards this turn. You can negate that card's effect for one turn, as long as you sent it previously, which is technically useful, but not a situation in which you would specifically play this card for, as its on-field effect allows you to special summon this card as a normal level 3 warrior type monster with no stats. So it's basically a trap monster that exists to use for extra deck plays. And the Phantom Knights do love level 3 monsters, so it fits in with their archetype. But they also have this other Phantom Knight trap monster called the Phantom Knights of Shade Brigandine, which can special summon itself as a trap monster during the turn it's sent. If it had a useful effect like that, then its graveyard effect would just be gravy on top of a good effect. But instead, it kind of has a mediocre trap monster effect with also a situationally useful mediocre graveyard effect, which is why I had to kind of give it a high spot on this list. And at number 1, we have Magical Blast. This card's effect, when you use it from your hand, allows you to inflict 200 damage to your opponent for each spellcaster type monster you control, which isn't super good. That's not a lot of burn damage, and rarely would you be trying to inflict burn damage when you had 6 spellcaster type monsters out, which would only deal 1200 damage anyway. And its graveyard effect is during the draw phase, you can add this card to your hand from your graveyard instead of drawing a card from your deck. And this card's effect is definitely not good enough where you'd want to add this card to your hand instead of drawing a card normally. So it's a pretty bad effect. However, this card did see competitive play one time in 2008 in a Lightsworn deck used in the World Championship. It was a side deck edition, which would only be used if they wanted to prevent themselves from decking out, as Lightsworn decks all have the effects that send a whole bunch of cards from your deck to the graveyard during the end phase. So if they went against any kind of stall, it would basically deck themselves out, which Magical Blast could technically prevent them from doing, though that's not something you'd really have to worry about, which is why it hasn't been used in really any other topping Lightsworn deck since. And I probably would have put the Iron Core of Koa'ki Meiru at the top spot if it wasn't for the fact that it could instead add itself to your hand by just discarding a monster, whereas Magical Blast can only add itself back by giving up your draw phase, which is only useful graveyard effect if you literally don't want to draw cards because you would lose, which is why it takes the top spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any other ideas for videos about the worst of certain types of cards, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. I have more than enough suggestions for best of top 10s. And did you know only 30.1% of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel? And then I have a playlist with over 100 Yu-Gi-Oh! Top 10 videos in it, which is the perfect thing to watch in the background while you play other video games.